My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
I also believe that events in Iraq have reminded America of the need to use diplomacy.
This is not a time to undercut our diplomats.
All right, folks, welcome to the final episode of Diplomatic Immunity / Headlines in History for the year 2025. And today, Tristen and I are going to give you a little bit different type of episode. We've done this in the past here at Diplomatic Immunity, but this year we're just going to do it with Tristen and I. And we're just going to kind of rehash a couple of what we thought were some of the major storylines of the year. And we're also going to think about and discuss some of the things that each of us thought were sort of under the radar things, things that we might have heard about or got discussed or were in the paper, but were sort of overtaken by these larger stories that were going on across the globe. And then we'll give you a little bit of the things that we're looking for in 2026 and watching out for. Spoiler alert, some of them are going to be very distinctly tied to some of the things that we felt were the biggest stories of this year as well. But anyway, so that's what we've got coming up today. No deep dive with somebody else, but we're going to end the year on this. And as you see, I've got the fire going. It's chilly here in our nation's capital. Tristen, I don't think it's quite as cold in Hong Kong.
No, I appreciate how festive and cozy it looks there. Here
I've got a stocking behind me.
Look at you. It's morning and it's 20 degrees here. It is a
That's
flawless blue
Celsius,
sky.
folks. That's
yeah.
Celsius. Yeah.
I don't know
Yeah.
what that is in American
Yeah,
Fahrenheit.
forgive him. He's Canadian. He's almost British. I don't know. So now he's in Hong Kong. Yeah.
Look, it's warm.
Yes, it's hot.
This will be my first Christmas experiencing the festive season, not needing a sweater or a hat, or as we call it at home, a toque, or anything warm and cozy.
Yeah.
But so far, I'm taking to this very nicely.
Yeah, it's interesting. I have never experienced a Christmas, New Year's in a warm climate. I've done New Year's, but not Christmas. So, but anyways, that's not going to change this year. So we'll be here celebrating the holidays. But it's DC Christmas. It's winter. It's like if you're from the South, it's rough. But if you're from Northeast Ohio, like I am, it's pretty mild. So nothing to complain about. And I like sweaters and fires. So it works out. Anyways, my voice is a little off tonight, folks. I'm getting over a cold. I also just coached a first grade girls basketball practice. So a lot of yelling going on there. Not that I'm yelling at the 6-year-olds. It's loud. It's loud in a gym. So I had to, project my voice quite a bit. Yes. So anyways, I'll try to make this through this as best I can. But all right. So, we're going to start off with talking about, and this is probably going to surprise no one, but the biggest issue that I saw as the biggest storyline of the year, and Tristen will follow up on this and some of the things that he saw within this as well, but obviously was the return of Trump to the presidency, and just the tectonic shift and change and movement on all fronts that has been. And I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say that it was massively different than in 2017. He has spent 4 years at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, and then 4 years out of office figuring out what he wasn't able to do in his first term and why. And he's now got folks around him that will do what he wants to do and know how to work the system. And we've seen that in the major changes over the past 11 months or so since he took the oath of office for the second time. And from day one, just massive changes in the foreign policy realm that are really, and it's not like it's affected just Ukraine or just the Gaza war or just US China. It's you know, these tariffs are touching everyone, multiple countries around the globe. The immigration restrictions and things like that. It's just solidified, I think, this view from others that the US is just a whole different ball game moving forward. This isn't, foreign policy stops at the water's edge. This is a drastic 180-degree turn, every time we have a new administration now. And
Mm.
that sets us up for a lot of difficult conversations with allies, partners, adversaries. Who's going to take us at our word on anything? Who's going to think that anything's going to be the same 3 years from now, or with the next president, 3 or 4 years after that? It's obviously thrown everyone for a loop with the Ukraine war, which we'll talk about more, Gaza, Palestine, tariffs, the international organizations, multilateralism, international trade, obviously. So I think, you know, I'll just stop there for now. And I know that the national security strategy came out a couple weeks ago, and that was a stark reminder, look at what this administration is hoping for in the world, the way it views the world, and what it's trying to do to create a world that it wants. And that has some major differences in approach, differences in tone, differences in long held beliefs that we've thought of as American views on foreign policy and who our allies were, how we interact with them, and where we're focusing our strategy. It has changed now with this new one, with more of a focus on Latin America. And yeah, so I mean, I think you can't, and I haven't even gotten into the dismantling of USAID and US aid across the world and what that means, not just for the millions of people on the ground that have, depend on that aid, but also just what it means for US soft power and geopolitical competition with countries like China. So, um, anyways, that's my first one. I know you want to you're
Yeah,
going to follow up on Trump as well, but
you
I'll
know,
I'll stop.
it really is no exaggeration to say that the return of Donald Trump to the Oval Office is the biggest foreign policy story of the year, and I really don't think that you are underselling it by noting that his return has changed everything in really dramatic, profound, and I fear lasting ways. I mean, you mentioned at the end there the uh, decimation of USAID, and we can and we should, and indeed on this podcast we have talked about the ways in which this brings incalculable harm to millions of people around the world. But let's also think about this in terms of American interests. And this is the great soft power asset of, or at least one of them, of the United States, just willingly abandoned. And think of the partnerships, think of the relationships that were cultivated over decades by way of America's incredible aid program, and exactly as you point out, the degree to which it left no space for rival powers, namely China, to take on that mantle of leadership in international aid and cultivate those relationships for themselves. And look, in the space of the first few months in office, all of that has been abandoned, and that it's remarkable. It is also, as you point out, just one example of so many where American foreign policy has dramatically changed, and this is, I fear, there's no turning back the clock on so much of what has happened. Towards the end there, you mentioned the national security strategy, which came out a couple of weeks ago. This is, I think, a fascinating document, and one that I think we're going to be studying for a very, very long time, particularly in comparison with those that came before it and whatever documents in the years to come
Yeah.
after. I hope that it is a abnormal instance of tone and content. I fear it isn't, but it's absolutely remarkable. And the first thing that I thought of when it came out and I read it is, it took me right back to J.D. Vance's speech at the
Mhm.
Munich Security Conference
Yeah.
at the beginning of this year. This is something we talked about in an earlier episode, and that was an incredible moment, where the U.S., well, in this case, the Vice President of the United States said, "We're, how we view Europe and or I should say, how we viewed Europe for the past 80 years, that's done now." And there were a lot of course, gasps at that. I remember a lot of discussion about whether or not, well, does he mean it? This just rhetoric? And here we have it now at the end
Right.
of the year, in many ways, word for word in the NSS, in the National Security Strategy. And that's, it really is, and we keep saying it, but it is worth repeating. It it is such a dramatic change. And also the other sort of point that as you were speaking came to mind is that, just the style of diplomacy um, is just
Mhm.
so radically different. Again, something we've talked about this year, but what engagement internationally is now for America is it's deals. It's
Yeah.
it's about it's not just, I mean, it is transactional, but it's more than that. It's about cutting a deal, and it's not about developing relationships. It's not about
W Yeah,
com
yeah, and it's almost like in a back channel kind of way too, right? It's not through the formal entities and process before, it's Steve Witkoff,
yeah, it's certainly not the
going
Secretary
around
of
the world,
State.
or Jared Kushner, yeah, or, normal diplomats or people that sort of, do that thing, tend the garden, as George Shultz,
Mhm.
used to say.
Yeah. Yeah, and so it is, look, we're obviously gonna be talking about this throughout 2026 and 27 and 28. It
Yeah.
has been a long 11 months, and, it already feels like so much, so much longer than that. And why don't we move on? Because, I think we could both just talk about the return of Trump
Right.
all
Well,
episode,
and
but
and he's obviously, as you'll see, listeners and watchers, he's gonna be wrapped up in these next 2 stories as well, and well, 3, 4 stories. But, moving on, I know this has been on everybody's list of, top issues, our next couple will be, but, you just can't not talk about Ukraine. And, it's shocking to me that in February, we'll be on year 4, or well, it'll be 4 years since the war started. I mean, we were, you think back to, I think back to where I was in that night of February 2022, and, you're thinking like, how long can they hold out? Is this gonna be over in 3 days, a week? And here we are, 4 years later, and the war is still going on. So I think, that's been a just a huge story all year long because of the reemergence of Trump, and the way they talked about Ukraine, during the election. JD Vance, obviously, and his comments, when he was running for senator in Ohio, about, not caring whatsoever about Ukraine, like that's not our thing. Like, why should we even be there? And Trump saying that he was going to end the war in the first 24 hours, and, all that stuff. And then huge questions around, is he going to stop aid to Ukraine on day one? Are they going to be able to maintain the war, their war effort, and keep moving forward with that without U.S. financial and arms backing? And, not to mention intel support and like
Mm.
all the things that the U.S. is doing. Um, that hasn't necessarily come to fruition. There has still been a flow of things to the Ukrainians, and, large questions about whether or not the Europeans would step up more, how they were going to react. And you can, talk a little bit more about that. But, I think the big thing is that there's been obviously some attempts to end the war in Ukraine. The first go round didn't go so well, with Trump meeting with Putin in Alaska and then meeting with Zelensky and the Europeans, and kind of going back on everything he had said after meeting with Putin in Alaska, and then nothing came of that. We seem to be in some sort of area now where these discussions seem like there's more there, but I don't necessarily think that means there's going to be a ceasefire or an agreement in the coming days or weeks. But I do see these as a more serious attempt to do something than that first attempt. But I do think Ukraine remains one of the major stories of 2025.
Yeah, unquestionably, and again, just sort of thinking as you're speaking there, like it is just the drama week in, week out that the American president has put us through in his new Trump reality Ukraine show, where every week we got to tune in because is he going to cut funding? Is he not? Is he flying off to Alaska to meet with the Russian president? What's going to happen? Tune in next week. Having Europe, the European leaders come and hold court with them in the Oval Office. I mean, week after week, day after day, it has been the Trump show with respect to Ukraine in so many ways. And like this is all without even mentioning the explosive interaction between Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky in the Oval Office back at the beginning of the year, which really sort of
Seems like it was 9 years ago.
totally, and just really set this season off. And so, yeah, it's been quite a year, and again, the return of Donald Trump has really conditioned this story, this war. But let's also think about sort of if we can just sort of take Donald Trump out of the equation, even just for a moment to analyze other dimensions of this war. I mean, one of the really, I think, fascinating, and I mean this, sort of clinic. I don't mean to be too clinical and dispassionate, but just sort of think about what we're seeing in the evolution of warfare in Ukraine. Right, this is in many ways, and due deference to George Lucas, but this is the beginning of the drone wars. And what we're seeing here is not a lowering in human casualties and human fatalities as we might have imagined would be the case if we start throwing robots at one another. Um, the idea, look, Ukraine, certainly for Russia, remains a meat grinder, as they say. And I think this is really interesting. I mean, obviously, we're seeing generations of particularly drones being produced very, very rapidly as this nature and style of drone warfare accelerates in Ukraine, particularly over the past year or two. But the casualties remain very, very high
Yeah.
as we head into year 4, right? What is it with Russia?
Like,
A little over a
million?
million?
Yeah, it's insane. Like, this is like World War I, World War II numbers. And, I think I will say I'm surprised that, you picked a Star Wars movie and went with one of episodes 1 through 3. But,
It made me uncomfortable, and I didn't like it.
it's the only one you could have got,
Exactly.
Clone
I had
Wars
no
fits.
choice.
I see what you did there, but, I think it's a fascinating issue, this evolution of warfare, and we talk about this a lot in DC. I've been following it closely, and you started off with like the quotes coming out of the first few months were that this is a World War I trench warfare fight coupled with a World War II tank battle fight, which that is kind of over now because the tanks can't really move around. Coupled with like drone warfare of the 21st century. So it was like you had aspects of all of these different things, but now just the the use of drones and like how difficult it is to move around and like the rapid movement you need to undertake, the cover that you always have to have. And it's just rapid evolution of warfare. And for somebody, for the US, I mean, it's been not a training ground necessarily because we're not in the war, but they've been watching this extremely closely and like understanding how this affects, the way that we have procured weapons since World War II. And the military industrial complex is great. Well, I'm not even going to say great anymore, but they can pump out aircraft carriers and submarines and F-22s when they know that they've got a 10, 15, 20-year timeline where they're going to get paid, and they can do that. But when you're like, hey, can we get like, you know, 50,000 of those $300 drones? They kind of are like, what are you, what? You know, and, so there's going to be not just in a way that we envision war and go about fighting it and the tools that we have, but like how we procure those weapons is drastically changing and needs to in a major way for future fights. And I think, that's to your point, that's something I found horrific, but also, fascinating with the Ukraine war and how it's demonstrating the evolution of warfare.
Yeah, well, this once again will be a story that I think we both flagged as one we're going to definitely be
Yeah.
following in
Yeah.
2026. Another story thinking of this past year that we both flagged as one of the major ones is Gaza, obviously. Um, you know, this was again just something. How many times did we cover it? I mean, almost every week on
Well,
our
yeah. I
podcast,
mean, we
right?
could have for
We could
sure.
have, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and I think, to your point, something new every week, and horrific most of the time. And it, I will say this is one of the, something you got to give credit to President Trump for what he did in Gaza and his ability or willingness to actually step up to the Israelis and Netanyahu and get them to the table. And I think he was able to do that. Now, we may not have liked the way he went about that, and we'll see what happens. The Israelis are still attacking different things in Gaza from time to time, and they may or may not be going into Lebanon. They've still been attacking in Syria and things like this. But for the moment, we have a ceasefire still holding in Gaza. And we just had a report on this come out at ISD. And one of the big things we flag is that as difficult as getting the ceasefire was, and this is going to creep into our what to watch for 2026, as difficult as getting that ceasefire was, that is ultimately the easy part compared to what needs to happen next, which is trying to find some sort of security force that is not the Israeli military, trying to disarm Hamas in some way, shape, or form, and something that they have adamantly been opposed to, trying to figure out some new governing body for interim governing body for Gaza until they can eventually get to a government of their own. I mean, these are things that are going to be incredibly difficult to try to work out and organize, and that's the stage we should be at this point and are trying to move to. So, that all being said, it's wonderful that we have a ceasefire in Gaza, but that is, step one of hundreds and thousands probably of steps that need to be taken for, humanitarian access, rebuilding Gaza, getting food and water and medical aid in there, so that people can at least eat, trying to make sure that Hamas does not come back to govern Gaza again, and all of these different things that are going to be extremely difficult. And But like I said, on the bright side, there is a ceasefire at the moment. And yeah, so again, something we will be watching closely in 2026. But for now, seems to be holding for the most part.
Absolutely, and if that's the best that we can have right now, we'll take it. But it
I will
really
take it.
is just such a gargantuan task ahead. The UN estimates that 90% of all homes in Gaza have been either damaged
Yeah.
or destroyed.
I mean, where do you even begin? Like, even that's the scale of the problem,
Yeah,
right? Like, even if you get a security apparatus in there and some sort of governing body, then you still have 90% of homes and structures destroyed. Like, how do you begin to rebuild so that people can come back and with 99.9% of the world's population just want to live their lives, make an income, have a livelihood, have human security, and raise their families, and that's what you wanna do.
Mhm.
You can't really do that in Gaza right now until they start rebuilding and doing those sorts of things. So there's a long way to go here, in Gaza, but at least for the moment, they're not fighting.
Yeah, and just to flag something for the year ahead, we should also be thinking about this in terms of Israel's domestic politics, right? Israelis want Netanyahu out. Netanyahu badly wants to stay in power. Um, Something's going to give, I presume. Actually, I don't have a crystal ball, but I feel like in the next year something's going to give on that front, and so I think we should be watching that,
If it does, I'm gonna have you, pick my lottery numbers.
right?
But, um well, it'll be interesting though too, right? Because, Trump has been pressuring the president of Israel to, pardon, or at least drop the charges or whatever against Netanyahu, which is one of the main, if not the main reason that he has wanted to stay in power. So if that's gone, do we see a world where Netanyahu is much more willing to step down? And, then what do we get? I would have to
Really?
imagine based on, changing opinion polls in Israel and things like that, you would see a more moderate, uh, um, government come into play. But, like you said, we'll have to see on that and see what
Yeah.
happens.
Yeah, and just to round out what I think you and I both discussed as being the biggest stories of the year. Again, no surprise here, it is a Trump-centric story, and it's the American tariffs that the American president levied on ostensibly on the rest of the world, which of course American citizens pay for. Look, this was a trade bomb that upended decades of convention in international trade. And we go all the way back to Bretton Woods, around the end of the Second World War. We're talking about the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade, the GATT, the WTO. All of that is history. I was at a French Chamber of Commerce event giving a talk a couple weeks ago, and they asked me, "So what about WTO?" And I gave what was perhaps too glib of a response, but it was just, well, like, what about it? It is, I mean, irrelevant. It's going nowhere. It's that is stalled. That is done. Um, and look, there's again so many different ways that we can analyze this, and indeed have on this show. The uncertainty for businesses, the financial impact on households in America, throughout the world is massive. And was it last? I you think I'd get used to the time zones, but I haven't yet. Was it last night, the night before, that the American president did that? Uh, Look, I'll say it, bizarre address before the nation, talking
That
about,
was last night. Yeah.
yeah, affordability. And was it last week that he had the rally in which he calls, well, everything, as his way, a Democrat hoax, and that actually you're not as bad off as you feel that you are. Which, I mean, if this were a show about American electoral politics, I think we would both agree that this is something we should talk about, and a massive, massive mistake heading into the midterm elections. But the point is that this is being felt by everyone, everywhere, and it completely and dramatically changes sort of the international trade topography. Um, and you know, look, we're back from where we were when the American president went out and inside the White House with his little Bristol board. Oh, Bristol board's a very Canadian thing. A poster board. That's it. Um, uh, Listing, what seemed to be, in many cases, random numbers, levying tariffs on the rest of the world and sending the world economy into a bit of a tailspin. We're not there anymore, but we're still far from a good, comfortable, or even stable position. And I think it's worth noting, particularly, that the principal target of the new tariff wars were China. It was meant to address a trade imbalance with what the American president and I'll call it a massive ripoff of the United States. And one of the things now sitting here in December that I think's worth noting is that, eh, China's doing fine. It hasn't really made much of a dent at all. I mean, look, as you and I discussed in a previous episode, China was ready for this, right? They've been preparing for the return of Trump. They were able to hit back. They were able to maneuver. They were able to reroute trade quickly and well. And of course, they also played their ace card, minerals. And this, again, the China-US trade story is certainly anything but over, but it does seem that there's a thawing relations. One of the things that we'll definitely be covering in 2026 are the heads of state visits by the American president to Beijing and likewise of Xi Jinping to Washington. Um, but it seems, a lot of damage was wrought, and I at least don't see much benefit that comes from it. But I'd be curious to hear your perspective.
Yeah, no, I'm same boat. I mean, we talked about it on the show before, when he met with Xi Jinping, and curtailed some of the tariffs, when Xi Jinping, let up on the export restrictions to critical minerals. Well, he put those in place because we put I mean, there was no win there, right? Like, it was done in response to the tariffs in the first place. So, it's this sort of kabuki theater with these tariffs, and the same thing. I mean, it was again, the last year has been like seven, but I think it was last week or the week before he came out where with the talk about giving tons of money to U.S. farmers because they're hurting so bad because of the tariffs. And he's like, well, we're able to give you this money because of the money we've made on the tariffs. And it's like, well, they wouldn't need the money if you had the tariffs, if the tariffs weren't in place, So it's just all so bizarre and not really, not doing the benefit that they think they're getting from it. And, and it's to your point as well with the randomness of a lot of this and the on again, off again
Mhm.
nature of a lot of these tariffs. Like, nobody that works in the business world wants to invest and do things in places where they're 1 week it's 50% tariffs, the next week it's 10, then it goes back up. And the one thing businesses don't like is this not knowing or not having an idea of what the future is going to look like. And that's, it's not helping the business climate. Um, in many ways, and we talked about this early on, if he was really trying to do what he wanted to do with American industry, he would put in place huge tariffs and he'd just leave them on so that America would have to build back its industry. But then by taking them off and doing these sorts of things, nobody is incentivized on the business end to actually do that and put the money in the United States. So it's, I don't really see what it is accomplishing other than making things more treacherous around the world, and alienating, dozens of other nations that we might need at some point in the future. So, um, yeah, and I don't think as we've discussed before, this doesn't seem to be going away anytime soon. And I think this is going to be kind of the playbook for at least the next year, if not moving forward, is this sort of wielding tariffs at willy-nilly, with whatever countries we want, allies, competitors, whomever. So we'll see. All right, so let's talk about a couple of the things that you and I felt went a little bit under the radar this year. Some of them way under the radar. Some might be coming more to the forefront now. But what are a couple things that you have been watching that might not have gotten as much media play as you think they should have?
Well, one of the first things that came to mind when we were shooting ideas about what was under the radar, and part of this is by virtue of me being here in Hong Kong, but it's certainly the tensions that have ratcheted up between Japan and China. I mean, obviously there is tremendous historical animosity between the two. Tensions have been kept relatively in check, but with the election of the new prime minister, things have begun sort of bubbling up, and indeed, one of the things that kicked this latest round of tensions off was the new prime minister saying that any move on Taiwan by Beijing could constitute a threat to Japanese security, and this sent Beijing
Which is
off.
a huge deal for Japan to say something like that too, given the last 80 years of their military structure and national defense and all that kind of stuff.
Exactly, and one, I think the tensions in and of themselves are something that we should, that has gone on under the radar. I think it's something that we might find ourselves talking about again in 2026. But I think it's indicative of something broader going on with respect to Japan's security posture, and Japan's role in the world, and in particularly in the Pacific. You know, we are seeing a Japan that is willing to talk about military engagement beyond just being a defensive force more. That's a rapid change. And as America retreats
Right. Yeah.
from the world, you know, Japan, at least in this theater, is likely the one to step up. And so this, I think, is a story that for me went under the under the radar. Clearly, I need more coffee this morning. The other one that came to mind, and even though we talked about it over the course of the years, is climate. And we did do a focused discussion on it in the wake of the COP summit. But look, I find it remarkable how little we are talking about climate change
Yeah.
and where we are heading. And I won't repeat what we talked about a few episodes ago, but I can't help but feel that like we are in the opening act of a disaster movie, and we are going about our lives pretty normally, and it's so obvious to the viewer sitting on the sofa
Yeah.
watching us in this film that like things are about to get really bad. How can you not see the alarm bells going off everywhere? Our incredible, and this is anecdotal, obviously, but our incredible, brilliant producer, Freddie, is in, I think, Denver right now, where it's December, there is no snow, there are wildfires. He's lost power. Well, not just Freddie personally, but there's a power outage because of the wildfires in December in Denver. We've broken the planet.
Yeah, it's like I can't help think about, watching those the bad 90s horror movies that I grew up on, and you're like, why is the babysitter running upstairs to the room with no exit? It's like what's going to happen here. But to your point, it's just it demonstrates to the leadership that the United States brings to these sorts of things. Love it or hate it, it does. And without that leadership, nobody has really stepped up. I mean, we talked about during the first Trump administration that maybe China would, and they are doing tons, obviously, leading the world in the green energy production of like solar panels and cars and things like that. But there's nobody there to really tie these countries down to like say we need to cut emissions, we need to do this. And not only that, the US is rolling these back. I mean, Ford just announced, I think 2 days ago, that they're stopping their EV production, and taking massive financial hits to do that kind of thing. So that's, my one thought on that. And just a quick follow up to your Japan China thing. I think you're spot on with sort of like, I think a large part of that has to do with the US not necessarily abdication of the Pacific, because there are a lot of China hawks in the administration, and that's still a big part of what they're doing. But the unreliability of the United States now, and Japan, looking at this from a realistic perspective and saying, Big Brother's not there over our shoulder necessarily in the way they've been for 80 years. We need to take up more of this on ourselves. And what does that mean? And as a historian who talks about this issue in one of my classes, um, you know, that history is rough between Japan and China, and it doesn't take much for that to come to the surface. Again, it may sit under the surface, but it can boil up very quickly because of that history between the two countries and the animosity that's there. So I think that's something that did fly under the radar, and is, again, we don't have it on our list of things to watch, but definitely something that I would keep my eye on moving forward. But so one of the things I have on my under the radar thing, and I know it's been in the news, but everything in the Middle East for the most part has been focused on Gaza, rightfully so to some extent. But I just have to say again, the overthrow of the Assad regime, which happened at the very end of 2024. And what's going on in Syria over the past year, I think, to me, has been somewhat of an under the radar story because of just how massive it is. If you think back to like so much of what's gone on in the Middle East since 2011 and the Arab Spring has been focused on, stemmed from the civil war in Syria. And if you look at ISIS and the rise of ISIS and all these different things, and that is now, that is over, hopefully. I mean, I know there's still issues going on in Syria with sectarian violence, and Shara still has a long way to go to lock that country down and try to get, so a lot of this is going to depend on what he does moving forward with trying to bring everybody in, making an actually inclusive government. You still have the Israelis taking military action in portions of Syria, to create sort of a buffer zone or something between them, and Syria. So, I think this has been a major. I mean, the fact that Trump met with Shara. I mean, this was a guy that was on the U.S. terror list that was part of ISIS, and it's just it's shocking on so many levels. But also, I think again, um, you know, something that we should that is a positive, because I think Trump did the right thing on meeting with him and recognizing him and trying to get Syria off of the sanctions list, because we need to rebuild Syria. We have an opportunity here, and a more stable Syria can be something that helps stabilize the entire region. And I think that's what's so important about what's happened in Syria in the last year, is that for the first time in definitely since 2011, but going back even further since the Assads have been in power, is moving Syria maybe in the right direction. And I think that is something that is monumental for the region, and something that should have been talked about a little bit more and focused on. But so that is one of mine. And another is, we've talked about this on this podcast, but Sudan, and just horrific fighting and humanitarian situation that has been going on in Sudan over the course of the past year. And there is a humanitarian ceasefire right now, thankfully. But I haven't seen anything in it. We talked to Declan Walsh about this a few weeks ago. I don't necessarily see anything that has changed that to the point where, they haven't settled their differences, right? It's a humanitarian ceasefire, which it was definitely needed, for the suffering people on the ground, and, famine going on, things like that. And, but I think, again, sadly, that went under the radar because of the high profile issues like Ukraine and Gaza. And this is, again, I shouldn't need to say this, but it does, I'm not taking anything away from the horrific nature of what's going on in Ukraine or Gaza. But, Sudan went under the radar and has been going under the radar. So, that was another one that I was watching this year. And I know we've talked about it, but I think it deserves more press and more focus from the administration and from others to try to remedy that situation, because it also, this is something that has drawn in many outside players, many Gulf countries that are funding the RSF, and others are funding the actual government military. And it's touching upon not just Sudan, but other countries in the region, and has the potential to really spiral out of control. And that's why I think we need to focus on this even more than we have been.
Yeah. Yeah, and the final story that has flown under the radar, I don't think it's fair to say it's under the radar anymore, but
Right.
that's Venezuela. And look, I mean, if I'm going to indelicately sing our praises, this is something that we talked about early on. This is something
Yeah.
we flagged, as things began to develop. And look, what is it now? But 15% of the US Navy is now in position in the Caribbean. I mean, there has been a slow and steady escalation, but this to me seems really significant. Of course, was it earlier this week? Again, time now just
Yeah.
makes no sense. Was it this week or late last week when the Americans seized a oil tanker, which seems to me like a massive escalatory
Yeah. And
step, and
now
certainly,
and now Maduro says that they're going to have Navy escorts.
indeed,
So what happens when you try to seize the next one?
what could go wrong there, huh?
Yeah. Yeah.
And look, it seems to me that this is unquestionably, I mean, for me, I think it's the number one thing that we're going to be looking ahead in 2026 too. But the pressure on Maduro, it seems, is only going to grow. Um, is the American president going to launch strikes on land? Is there some other means by which he can apply pressure? And again, just thinking about the national security strategy, which we were talking about earlier, one of the key themes, and this is, I think, my favorite contradiction in the entire piece, and it's tough to choose one, but is a key theme is like, we are non-interventionist, except when it comes to Venezuela and well, we didn't talk about it, but Europe. But it's just yeah, this unquestionably, I think, is going to be continuing to dominate the headlines in January.
Yeah, and I think that's a good transition, because one of our first points to watch out for in 2026 is Venezuela. And because we're at the point now where you mentioned, 15% of the US Navy is there. There's been this massive buildup. He's now seizing oil tankers and says they will keep seizing those. Yeah, and where does this go from here? Does he envision, I think even, I think some sort of land invasion by a large force, I think a is unlikely. I will say that. Just because of the way that the President Trump has talked about intervention and boots on the ground and things like that. Now, covert ops, CIA kind of things, I could see something like that happening, but they obviously want Maduro out the door. And one thing that we need to watch out for and keep on our radar moving forward is the role of Cuba in all of this, because Cuba has been doing so much to prop him up, because Venezuelan oil is so important to Cuba. But this also ticks off a couple of boxes for President Trump, and also folks like Secretary of State Rubio, who has been a Cuba hawk forever, because his family left Cuba and lost land and everything during the revolution. So there is, kind of a two birds, one stone kind of thing, I think, in their thinking on this. But I don't think, um, I think they're going to continue pushing for Maduro to leave in some way, shape, or form. But then that also opens up a potential can of worms on who takes over. I mean, there's the benefits of this, and we heard, someone very knowledgeable on Venezuela speak a couple nights ago at Georgetown. And, the one good thing that Venezuela has going for it, unlike in Afghanistan or Iraq, is there's not necessarily the ethnic or sectarian
Mm,
differences within the country. There's more of a close-knit nature of folks in Venezuela, which might bode well if there is some sort of vacuum, if Maduro would leave in one fashion or another. I think this is gonna be, unless something drastically happens and shifts the storyline on Ukraine, or if, Gaza falls apart, I think this is going to be the main US foreign policy storyline going into 2026 and for the foreseeable future. Like, what exactly happens there?
yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned both Ukraine and Gaza, and we also flagged those as what to watch in 2026. Will the ceasefire, as we were talking about earlier, hold in Gaza to the extent that it is? And will we get one in Ukraine?
Yeah, and, obviously, the Ukraine is in the process, potentially, and there's, large discussions and, I won't get into it deeply because 'cause we've talked a lot about it over the course of the last year and more, but there's still, still a long way to go, right? Like, what is, each side willing to give up, to get to a ceasefire? Is Ukraine willing to give up land? Is Russia willing to take less land and some sort of security guarantees for Ukraine? So there's extremely difficult negotiations to go on here. That's top of the radar, as is Gaza, and we talked about the difficulties inherent in that. But I'm just going to throw out one more um, potential catastrophic thing in 2026, that I've been reading a bit about lately and has been in the news. We've touched on AI now and then on the podcast, and obviously that's something we haven't talked about yet this episode. But massive growth in AI over the course of the last 3 years, especially this year with the Trump administration coming in, been, all guns blaring on, pro AI, take off the reins, passing executive orders to not allow states to have different regulations than the federal government and things like that to, quote, hamper the growth of AI and things like what's the worst that could happen, right? Um, but um, you know, uh, one thing I'm looking for and watching in 2026 is this so-called AI bubble that folks have been talking a lot about, and that's the fact of it's a lot of the funding and we're talking billions and billions of dollars that are massive amounts of money that have been going in to fund AI data centers and these companies, but they have yet to, profit and make a product that people are buying. There's no iPhone with this yet
Mm.
that people will go out and buy in massive quantities. And, are we gonna get to the point where there is no return, but these people are overextended in all of this financial input into these data centers and all these billions of dollars and things like that. That's been talked a lot about lately, and something that could really, because the stock market today is so tied to these
Oh my goodness,
tech
yes.
companies and everything. What would that mean if this bubble does come to fruition? We all have the dot-com bubble in mind from 2000. How would this play out in today's economy? Thankfully, it's not 1929, and our stock market and the way that we fund stocks aren't of the same nature that they were back in the 1920s. You could go get a loan for put 10% down and go buy stocks with that loan. Doesn't seem so great in retrospect. We're not living in that world, thankfully. Yeah, just so much of the growth in the United States right now is tied to these things. What would that mean if there is an AI bubble? So that's the last thing I'm kind of. There's many more, but the last one that
Yeah.
made the final cut of the record today.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah, and just as a coda to that, I mean, we should be watching whether or not the bubble will burst, but we should also be watching, well, what is AI going to be able to do in the next year when you and I are sat here in a year's time? I mean, just think of the power that these large language models have and have exponentially gotten better at and more powerful in just the past 12 months. Where are we going to be uh, in terms of productivity, but also, I mean, particularly politically? You know, we're heading into the midterm elections in the United States, and like, look, deep fakes are near perfect thanks to AI. Whether it's video, whether it's images, whether it's speech. How is this? How is the power and the ease with which we can use AI, particularly in the world of politics, just because it's what we obsess over? How is this going to affect politics in the next year, particularly electoral politics? And you know, I just, again, thinking of the American context and sort of the memification of politics, and you know, I don't see, I certainly don't see that going away. And one of the things that I'm curious to watch, if with bated breath, is, well, does this further erode political discourse? How does this condition political campaigning? Uh, you know, not that I well, it seems that I might just trade on being a pessimist, and maybe that's true, but like I worry it will continue to degrade the level of political discourse.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we thought we had it tough figuring out what was real before, and it's just going to get worse. I mean, I'm not even. This isn't even me. I'm in the other room watching the Seahawks Rams Thursday night game.
Yeah.
This is all. This is. I'm AI right now. This is
No, I'm
not.
not here either.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
still in bed. I'm still
yeah,
asleep. Yeah.
yeah. Exactly. Yeah. We laugh, but that could actually be the podcast in a year. Um, but all right, man. Well, again, you know, folks, it's been a big year, and more to watch out for in 2026.
Absolutely.
Make sure you're listening to and now watching Diplomatic Community and Headlines in History. And all right, man. Happy holidays. Good
You
seeing
too.
you as always. Have a
January.
great day. Yeah, and we'll see you on the flip side in 2026.
You bet.
All right, man. This show is produced by Freddie Mallinson and Abdalla Nasef. Thank you to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for their support for this podcast. Be sure to check out any episodes you may have missed via our website. Please rate, review, and follow this podcast wherever you listen, and tell your friends and colleagues to come find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else they listen. Follow us on Twitter @GU Diplomacy, and visit our website, isd.georgetown.edu, to learn more about our work. I'm Kelly McFarland. Until we meet again.